When most folks picture the Wild West, they're thinking of dusty saloons, six-shooter duels, and outlaw hideouts scattered across the American frontier. But north of the border, Canada's version of the West wasn't quite as trigger-happy. While the US frontier birthed legends like Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok, the Canadian West was a quieter, slower-moving affair, more concerned with fur trading posts than shootouts, and more often policed by paperwork than pistols. Still, there were flickers of frontier drama: whiskey smugglers, gold rush fever, and tense standoffs over which fur trading company controlled what land. To understand how these historical events differed from their United States counterparts, here's a deeper dive into the question: did Canada have a Wild West? It may not have looked exactly like the Hollywood version, but the Klondike Gold Rush in the Yukon gave Canada a Wild West moment of its own, packed with danger, desperation, and a flood of dreamers chasing riches in the frozen north. The rush began in August of 1869, when Skookum Jim and his family discovered gold near the Klondike River. It didn't take long for local miners to stake claims and try to get in on the action. But once the news reached the outside world, especially cities like Seattle, things exploded. Nearly 100,000 people from all walks of life dropped everything to head north, thinking they could strike it rich. It was a modern-day gold fever, and it would shape entire regions almost overnight. Getting to Klondike was no small feat. Some wealthy adventurers took an all-water route that wound through rivers and around Alaska's coastline, but this method was expensive and slow. Others braved risky paths overland, with some arriving long after the gold had already been claimed. The majority chose what was seen as the most practical option: trekking over the White Pass or Chilkoot Trail. These were brutally difficult mountain routes, starting from ports in Alaska and ending at the headwaters of the Yukon River. Travelers first had to sail north, then haul their gear over treacherous terrain, often in freezing temperatures and deep snow, before building makeshift boats to float hundreds of miles to Dawson City, the epicenter of the rush. Boomtowns like Skagway sprang up in a matter of months. Where once they had been quiet stretches of beach and fishing grounds used by the Tlingit people, they were now long docks, general stores, saloons, and brothels. Skagway became a hotspot, and with it came trouble. A criminal named Jefferson Soapy Smith took advantage of naive newcomers, running scams and shaking people down. In these lawless pockets of civilization, women often made their livings as sex workers, out-earning many of the service jobs that catered to the gold seekers. The trails themselves were brutal. The Chilkoot Trail forced people to carry every bit of their gear on their backs, often taking dozens of trips to move everything just a few miles. Until mechanical tramways were installed, it was grueling work in deep snow and biting wind. The White Pass Trail was infamous for a different reason. It earned the nickname Dead Horse Trail because thousands of animals died from exhaustion and abuse as desperate prospectors tried to force them over the rocky trail. Roughly 20,000 to 30,000 hopeful miners slogged up those trails during the first year of the rush. Though the distance was only about 35 miles from tidewater to the lakes, the back and forth hauling made it feel like hundreds. Once at the lakes, they crafted homemade boats and began the final stretch, over 500 miles downriver to Dawson City. By the summer of 1898, the town was teeming with 18,000 people, but many who arrived late found that those best claims were already taken. Within months, most stampeders were heading home with empty pockets, and when gold was discovered at Nome, Alaska the following year, the crowd moved on. The Klondike Gold Rush burned hot and fast. Towns that had seemed permanent quickly emptied. Some faded away entirely, leaving behind nothing but skeleton buildings and broken dreams. For a brief time, though, Canada's Yukon was as wild and unpredictable as anything south of the border. A place where fortunes were made, lives were lost, but the frontier spirit ran high. Canada, too, had its own version of this chaotic and often lawless period. A frontier just as rugged, just as volatile, and every bit as soaked in whiskey. Life on the North American frontier, whether in the United States or Canada, was grueling. The daily grind of surviving in harsh conditions wore people down. In both places, alcohol became a kind of fuel, part coping mechanism, part social glue, and all too often, a match to powder. Rum, brandy, and whiskey weren't just recreational. They were currency, medicine, escape, and entertainment. And as with the American West, the Canadian frontier's relationship with alcohol was messy and, at times, devastating. While a few frontiersmen managed to steer clear of the bottle, they were rare exceptions. More commonly, drinking went hand in hand with violence and ruin. In the United States, figures like Tom Horn, Sam Houston, and John Wesley Hardin became cautionary tales of men brought low, or pushed over the edge entirely, by booze. The saloons of cattle towns and mining camps were breeding grounds for chaos, with most fights and killings sparked during or after heavy drinking. Canada saw similar scenes. The country's aforementioned fur trade ran on alcohol. Traders used rum and whiskey to grease the wheels of commerce with indigenous communities. Everyone involved knew it was unethical, but the demand was high and the profits too tempting. Alcohol wasn't just a trade item, it reshaped entire cultures. Some of those indigenous communities, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of potent liquor, suffered immense harm. It distorted traditional hunting practices, eroded social structures, and pushed people into cycles of addiction and exploitation. Women were especially vulnerable and sometimes coerced into trading sex for alcohol, for themselves or for male relatives. One notorious hotspot of this era was Fort Whoopa in present-day Alberta. Set up by American traders crossing the border from Montana, this whiskey post operated without restraint, drawing indigenous customers with illegal booze and flying the stars and stripes in the heart of the Canadian plains. Things got so out of hand that Canada had to form the Northwest Mounted Police, the forerunner to the RCMP, in part to shut down Fort Whoopa and restore order to the region. It was a move that echoed the establishment of law enforcement agencies in the American West, where towns hired marshals and sheriffs to deal with similar waves of frontier lawlessness. And just like in the US, alcohol often dulled the senses at the worst possible moments. Certain indigenous groups, like the Apaches, brewed their own drinks, only for drunken arguments to erupt into fatal fights. In some cases, intoxication left camps vulnerable to attacks, as was the case with scalp hunters preying on inebriated warriors. In Canada, the dangers weren't limited to outside threats. The bottle bred enough internal strife to fracture communities and leave generations scarred. So why was alcohol so deeply rooted in frontier life? Simply put, the frontier was hell on the body and mind. Pain, loneliness, disease, and isolation were constant companions. A drink could warm you up, help you forget, or ease a day's burden. For fur traders, whiskey was both a luxury and a bargaining chip. For settlers, it was a way to turn surplus grain into profit. And for many soldiers or trappers living in remote outposts, it was the only entertainment available. Instead of cattle drives and gold rushes, Canada's Wild West was rooted in a fur trade that stretched across vast wilderness, involved intense rivalries, and sparked both cooperation and violent conflict with indigenous nations. It may not look exactly like the American frontier, but Canada's westward expansion had its own rugged and chaotic character. Canada's frontier story began early, long before cowboy culture took hold in the United States. French explorer Jacques Cartier made some of the first European contacts in the 1530s and 1540s, dabbling in trade with indigenous groups along the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Though he focused on decorative furs and missed the economic potential of the beaver, his voyages planted the seeds of what would become a fur-driven frontier economy. The real fur trade kicked off when European fishermen, particularly the Basques, began working the rich fishing grounds off Newfoundland in the 1500s. These men needed ports to dry cod and started trading metal tools for warm beaver robes with local indigenous groups. At the time, the fishermen had no idea these furs would become prized in Europe for making felt hats. But once beaver pelts gained popularity, demand skyrocketed, and what started as casual coastal trading turned into a full-blown economic engine, driving European expansion inland. The French cemented their role in the fur trade by founding Quebec in 1608. This marked a major shift. French traders began moving west from the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes region. Samuel de Champlain, one of the key leaders of this movement, forged strategic alliances with indigenous groups like the Huron and Algonquin. These alliances were not just about trade. They were political and military partnerships that often pulled the French into long-standing rivalries, especially against the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. To better understand the land and the people, Champlain sent young Frenchmen to live among indigenous nations. Champlain also restructured the fur trade as a business, first informally, and later under royal charters. These charters created trade monopolies like the Company of 100 Associates. In theory, these companies were supposed to bring settlers, build defenses, and share profits with the crown, but enforcement was loose, and unlicensed traders flourished. These independent fur traders often operated outside official control, sometimes intermarrying with indigenous women and giving rise to the Métis, a unique cultural group that would play a central role in Canada's frontier life. Their deep knowledge of the land and trade made them key figures in the untamed world beyond colonial settlements. Competition for fur riches also brought chaos. European goods, especially firearms and alcohol, disrupted indigenous societies. As beaver populations were hunted out in some areas, tribes fought fiercely for control of remaining trapping grounds. The Iroquois, in particular, launched a series of brutal campaigns, later known as the Beaver Wars, to dominate trade routes and cut out rival middlemen. They raided neighboring nations, adopting captives into their communities, and escalating violence across the region. At the same time, disease brought by Europeans, like smallpox, ravaged indigenous populations, compounding the effects of war and making some communities nearly disappear. By the mid-1600s, the fur trade had sparked a chain reaction of upheaval, movement, and bloody conflict across what is now Ontario, Quebec, and beyond. Eventually, the French crown took control of New France after repeated Iroquois raids crippled its main trading company. King Louis XIV sent soldiers to enforce peace, but even temporary truces, fur trade remained a source of friction, not only between settlers and indigenous nations, but also between rival European empires. When English-backed traders began operating from Hudson Bay, new territory opened up. French explorers pushed further into the interior, But after being punished for trading without a license, they turned to the English for support. Their efforts helped launch the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670, an outfit that would become one of the most powerful forces in Canada's western expansion for over 200 years. From there, French and later British explorers kept pushing west, building forts and trade networks deep into the heart of the continent. Their westward journey wasn't filled with cowboys and duels, but it was every bit as wild. It involved isolation, danger, political intrigue, cross-cultural relationships, and survival in a harsh landscape. When we ask whether Canada had a Wild West, the answer is yes, but it didn't always look exactly like its American counterpart. Instead of outlaws and gunslingers riding through the sun-kissed deserts, Canada's frontier was shaped by immoral pelts, native resistance, and the long arm of British, and later Canadian, law, trying to impose order. But the fight for gold-induced riches, the cultural collisions, the heavy drinking, and the high-stakes fur trading, all the hallmarks of frontier madness, were there in full force.